Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to see the presentation. As Gordon mentioned, I have the privilege of leading Cubic Corporation's transportation business unit, and the legacy of our company, for about the last 50 years, we've been the leader in transit payment systems. And as Gordon mentioned, nearly 8 years ago, we created a vision called NEXTCITY, which was all about how do we reshape the Cubic transportation business to really deliver future mobility in the context of future smart cities, a movement that has now become well known as mobility as a service. And I'm going to spend some time talking to you about mobility as a service in general, and then I'm going to zoom into 4 cities where we're actually working on implementing much of the vision that I'll talk about. So the first thing to think about is, what is mobility as a service? And if you did any research on mobility as a service, you'll see a variety of different definitions out there about what mobility as a service is. The first thing I'd like to talk about is what it's not. Mobility as a service is not just about connected and autonomous vehicles. It's not just about on-demand ride-sharing services, and it's not just about technology. So at Cubic, as part of our NEXTCITY strategy, we created a definition for mobility as a service. And for us, fundamentally, what we think mobility as a service is, it's about connected end-to-end journeys that make a seamless experience for the consumer or the rider that's trying to move from point A to point B, addresses every single customer segment, providing equity across the region, and is enabled through an integrated single charge, single journey planning construct. Why would we want to do this? So in terms of the benefits, obviously what we're really trying to do is promote multimodalism, but the reason we're trying to promote multimodalism is to ease congestion. Fundamentally, mobility as a service needs to be about increasing sharing, because if we're fundamentally constrained in terms of how much we can expand our infrastructure, and with population growth and urbanization, we need to move more people through this constrained piece of infrastructure. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we can increase sharing and obviously reduce reliance on cars, reduce the number of vehicles on the road, leverage that infrastructure better. And really, the best form of sharing in the transportation environment, of course, is public transit. So although that public transit's not necessarily the right service to address every journey, certainly if the ambition is to increase sharing, then surely part of that has to be about promoting transit as central to the concept. There's challenges with this. At the moment, there's a degree of disintegration. If you want to manage your journey, you may go to your transit provider's mobile app. If you need to connect to a ride sharing or some other car sharing scheme, you may go to an Uber app and so on. So for you to be able to plan that end-to-end journey, you need to go to multiple services that are provided by multiple service providers. That's a challenge in terms of implementing mobility as a service. And that's unlikely to change. The service providers are going to want to be able to engage with their customers through their own applications. So really what we need to be able to do is figure out how do we integrate data and how do we integrate those services so that if you do want to have an integrated experience, you can. And of course, in order to do that, you need to have standards, and you also need to have economic models that promote that degree of data sharing and integration. At Cubic, we believe that the transit system, as I mentioned earlier, it is the best form of sharing that you have in transportation. We think transit needs to be the backbone of mobility as a service because of the density it creates in terms of journeys. Transit already has multimodal systems and technology that promotes multimodal systems. So in the Bay Area, for example, the Clipper card, which is a Cubic-provided system, is a single payment system that you can use to ride the ferry, a bus, the train, BART, the trolley. You can ride across all of these various different modes of public transit using the Clipper card. And as you think about connecting journeys and connecting other operators into that, leveraging a platform like Clipper as the mobility as a service platform, we think, is the most logical way of implementing this. And as I said, I'll go through a series of examples of where cities are actually doing that. So NEXTCITY is our mobility as a service strategy at Cubic. And as I said before, this is really about integrating journeys end to end for consumers through a single payment system, a single information and journey planning system, and a single network management system. Really, with the fundamental objective of presenting the transportation network to riders as an integrated system. We see that based on 3 technology platforms. The first, delivering that integrated payment through a single account for the rider, an integrated customer experience through an integrated information and planning application, at least for the foreseeable future, based on mobile technology, and integrated network management and response through a congestion management platform. At Cubic, our customers, all of our revenue pretty much comes from government agencies of some kind, and we believe it's critical that government agencies are the organizations that lead the implementation of mobility as a service. We think it's required because in order to optimize the flow of people through a region, that needs to be the primary objective, is how do we optimize how people move around a region. No private enterprise is going to be able to solely focus on that objective because they have other objectives they need to meet, including returning for their shareholders. There's also an argument that there's many segments of customers, whether they're income disadvantaged, mobility disadvantaged, age disadvantaged, that may not necessarily be well served by a private enterprise, and therefore government is the right organization to lead the implementation of this, and also, excuse me, and also to promote the right allocation of subsidies, because most journeys are subsidized in some form, whether it's a public transit ride or to some degree an Uber ride today is actually subsidized. It's not a profit-making journey, and therefore that subsidy needs to be coordinated and allocated in the way that's beneficial to the region mostly, and therefore, again, that's why we think government are the right organizations to lead mobility as a service. Excuse me. So the first customer I'd like to talk about is Los Angeles. And Los Angeles have been moving out on their mobility as a service strategy, and the first thing they did is they looked at what degree of rider satisfaction was out there and what new services were riders demanding. They then took an inventory of their technology, including their fare system, which is provided by Cubic, and third-party proposals to partner on extensions of new modes, and they assessed the fit of that with the demand that they assessed from their customers. They then examined what the right agency and partnering agency modal influence, to what extent is the technology addressing the objectives. They then documented and socialized the decisions they made through those steps. They looked at how do they evolve their existing technology, including their fare collection system, their tap card system, and how do they then integrate third-party services. They then looked at the organizational fit for how do the operational services, the actual provision of the journey, to what extent do they want to do that in-house, or to what extent do they want to outsource. They then started moving out on executing the necessary contracts, including signing a contract with Cubic to extend the LA tab card system and implement a mobile application that will become the mobility as a service application for the LA region. They then are going to start phasing in new services, defining the web and customer support strategy, awarding those contracts, defining the mobile strategy, of course, based around this mobile application that we'll implement, and then start awarding the operations contract. Excuse me. They then start phasing in the new services. Next year, we'll launch a mobile application pointed towards the travelers, as well as to merchants that will allow third-party retail of value into the mobile application, and then implementing the necessary technology infrastructure upgrades to support that optimization, and then really rolling out their public communications plan. They'll then start entering into agreements with the new modal partners, whether that's Uber or bike sharing, that will enable that connected journey. And then they'll start phasing in those services. And ultimately, LA Metro becomes the account-based integrator for mobility as a service in the LA region. I mentioned Clipper earlier on in the presentation. They are moving forward with mobility as a service, and I mentioned the Clipper card system in San Francisco. That's already connecting all of these multiple modes of transit, which is accomplished through that Clipper card system. So they started to then engage the region in saying, how do we want to move beyond just transit into mobility as a service thinking? They started to dialogue with the larger agencies around what the MAAS solutions in the region might look like. They started to do small integrations. So for example, the Clipper card got extended to basically unlock forward Go bikes. And there's some parking applications that Clipper also enables. They then started to think about what does the next generation of the Clipper card system. They very recently awarded Cubic the Clipper 2 contract, which essentially is extending Clipper into an account-based environment, which will allow them to extend into more mobility as a service applications through an API-centric approach for bike and scooter sharing examples. Then start tying into bus rapid transit and parking transfers, as well as new loyalty programs and incentives that can then be added to that account-based Clipper system. And then extending into the TNCs, Uber, Lyft, and so on, as well as for paratransit, Lifeline programs, and so on. And then MTC, which is the customer of the Clipper card system, like LA Metro, then becomes the account-based integrator for MAAS in the region. Another customer that I'd like to talk about is the Chicago Transit Authority, obviously in Chicago. They were the first transit operator in this country to launch an account-based system for their transit operation. It's called the Venture Card system. Alongside Venture, they launched a mobile app, a Venture mobile app, which has had over 3 million downloads, which basically allows you to do an integrated journey across the various different transit providers in the Chicago region. The city of Chicago has launched a mobility task force to define their mobility roadmap and their mobility as a service strategy, with the goal of establishing Venture as the mobility as a service platform for the Chicago region. Early in the new year, we will enhance the Venture mobile app to provide truly multimodal journey planning beyond just the transit. So that's connecting that integrated journey and information planning and management component. We'll then integrate the Divvy bike sharing scheme into that mobile app, so as well as being able to plan a journey that includes Divvy, you will then also be able to pay for your journey, including the Divvy component of the journey. We will then upgrade the Venture back office, essentially to deliver those same APIs that I was talking about for San Francisco that will allow the integration of the other modes, which will obviously meet the mobility goals of the Chicago region's mobility task force. And similar to LA and San Francisco, the Chicago Transit Authority will then end up being the account-based integrator for mobility as a service in the Chicago region. And then finally, I want to take us to Australia to talk about Brisbane, another one of our customers that's taking a very similar approach to realizing mobility as a service. The first thing they're doing is determining the role of government. As I mentioned earlier, we have a strong view that the government needs to lead mobility as a service. Well, in Brisbane, they're going through defining essentially what is that role. And then they're researching and learning from existing mobility as a service deployments around the world, including some of the other customers that Cubic is working with to define essentially what their desired end state needs to look like. They'll obviously then conduct a gap analysis comparing those two things to essentially work out what their priorities for mobility as a service are going to be. They've also, similar to San Francisco and Chicago, they've recently also awarded us a contract to upgrade their back office system to be an account-based system. And they've established a MAAS program office that sits across government that will really kind of start to define how that gets used, as well as identifying and engaging with their various different stakeholders to look at what that desired end state is. Similar to LA, they will then look at what does the customer demand and customer needs look like across the region. The state of Queensland is a very diverse state, with Brisbane as being a major urban hub, as well as many rural districts as well that will be part of the same system. They'll then develop their roadmap to how do they get to that end state. That program management office that I mentioned will then make recommendations to the Queensland government and the Department of Transport and Main Roads. They'll then work with the state and the regions and the operators to then start executing on that roadmap. The account-based system that I mentioned will become that one account platform for the entire state of Queensland for all forms of transportation. They'll then introduce a mobile app similar to the one that I described in Los Angeles and Chicago that does the connected journey planning and information component. Then they'll upgrade the back office again to integrate the third-party operators they identify to be part of their mobility as a service platform, things like tolling, ride-sharing, etc. They'll then introduce a congestion management platform, which was that third platform that I described that does the integrated operations and network management. And then finally, like with LA, Chicago, and San Francisco, the Department of Transport Main Roads in Queensland will become the account-based integrator for mobility as a service, not only in the Brisbane region, but also for the entire state. And I've just run out of time. I want to thank you for listening to the presentation. I'll be hosting a lunch, and I'll be happy to address any questions over that lunch. Thank you very much.